and we're very, very excited to have him here today to receive the award. So the winner of the 2008 Randy Seidel Excellence in Justice Award goes to Marc Maurer.
Well, thank you so much. This is a real treat, a real honor. I think I should make a correction. I think you said it was a 2008 award, and I wasn't nearly as experienced then as I am in 2018. That's okay. No problem at all. No, it really is an honor, and especially it's an award named after a person who's been through so much in the system and so illustrative of what the system can do to people and how the system can make mistakes too. I'm sort of pleased that Dr. Grimes gave a very nice introduction and the things I've written. She didn't mention my first book, which is called Race to Incarcerate, and people often mention that as one of the things I've done, but you have to be careful about it. When the book first came out, I was giving a talk at one of the bookstores in Washington, and a newsletter went out promoting the talk and said Marc Maurer will speak about his new book, Race to Incinerate. So it's not incarceration, incineration there, but I want to talk to you about prisons this morning and the problem of prisons and the problem of mass incarceration. So my time this morning, I'd like to talk about race in the criminal justice system. I think there's probably no area of American society where race and social policy comes together in more of a class and more tension than in the criminal justice system. We only have to look at experiences of the last several years, just dramatic stories of police killings of black men. We look at policies like stop and frisk in New York, Philadelphia, and many other cities, their impact on communities of color. We look at the impact of the war on drugs and how that has impacted low-income communities of color in particular. All of these developments have led some people to call mass incarceration the civil rights issue of the 21st century. So I want to just try to lay out what I think are the outlines of mass incarceration, its racial dimensions, where it comes from, and where we are today, and maybe a little bit about where we could be going if we want to try to address these challenges. Now we start off with, I think, a sort of real dilemma in understanding some of these dynamics. If we think back a little more than half a century, let's imagine we're back in 1954. So that's the year of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. On the day of that historic decision, there were about 100,000 African Americans behind bars in the United States, 100,000 African Americans in prison or jail. Since that time, we've had the opening up of the civil rights movement in this country. Social and economic opportunities now available to many people for whom that was not possible before. If we look in the criminal justice system, it's now not unusual to see people of color in leadership positions as commissioners of corrections, police chief, judges, and other leaders. So we've made great progress in American society. Not nearly enough, but we have made substantial progress. Many people have more opportunity than they did back in 1954. And yet, if we look at our system of incarceration, that figure of 100,000 African Americans behind bars has now exploded to 700,000 behind bars. So how can we understand this seeming contradiction, the opening up of opportunity, and yet when we look at the prison system overall, and especially for African Americans, just a massive expansion of social control? Well, I think part of the answer is to look at other developments that were going on in American society. So yes, we had the civil rights movement starting in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But particularly in the early 1970s, American society was undergoing many economic and social changes. So we had the beginnings of deindustrialization, a lot of the manufacturing jobs that had helped working class people, black, white, and others get good jobs. A lot of those jobs were going overseas, and increasing globalization, really starting to see the beginnings of very vast inequality in American society, which, as you know, over the last 40 years, has really grown dramatically. People at the top are doing very, very well, and people at the bottom are doing very poorly. We also saw that a lot of these changes particularly affected urban communities of color in terms of opportunities, economic opportunities available to them. This was a time when we saw the rise of the baby boom generation coming of age. All things being equal, young men between the ages of 15 and 24 have a disproportionate involvement in crime. This cuts across lines of race and class, whether it's hormonal or cultural, whatever it is, we see elevated rates of crime when we have this bulge in the population of these young men. So we did see that there was a rise in crime in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and policymakers needed to address this rise in crime. Now, when we have a problem of crime or just public safety goals in general, there are a variety of ways that we can deal with these problems. Some of that has to do with creating opportunity. How do we improve education for people to make it equal for all? How do we create employment opportunities, good jobs, good wages for people? How do we deal with problems of substance abuse, mental health issues, addressing some of the underlying contributors to crime, and also criminal justice interventions are part of the public safety response. So there's a variety of ways we can deal with crime problems, but to the extent that the crime problem of the 60s and early 70s was described and perceived by many as a, quote, black problem, then all of a sudden criminal justice became the primary approach to dealing with this problem. And criminal justice policy then evolved as tough on crime. And tough on crime basically meant adopting sentencing policies, incarceration, parole policies designed to send more people to prison, keep them there for longer periods of time. This is very conscious strategies at the federal level, basically every state. Incarceration was the answer to the problem. But why was this defined or perceived as a black problem? Well, I think we know something about it from survey research been done a number of different places over time. If you look at how people perceive who's committing crime, and to what extent do they perceive African Americans as criminals, if you think of it that way. Well, if you just look at basic arrest statistics, we know that African Americans are disproportionately arrested compared to their share of the population for many property crimes and violent crimes. You don't have to dig very deep, though, to see that what might be perceived as a race issue is really a question of poverty, particularly concentrated poverty and the disadvantages that come along with that. So we do see some disparities in who's arrested for crimes, but when you do research and you say to people for a particular crime, what proportion of this crime, the people committing it, do you believe are African American? White respondents typically provide answers, estimates that are 20 or 30% higher than is the actual figure that we know from police data, 20 or 30% higher. Now, this may come from media imagery, it may come from outright racism, a whole variety of things may explain it, but typically overestimating by quite a bit. Then the next step is researchers ask people about punishments for crime. Given a certain crime, how much should we punish a person? How much should we provide treatment, alternatives, incarceration, and the like? And we find here is that to the extent that a particular crime is perceived, again, as a so-called black crime, support for punishment increases. To the extent it's seen as a white crime, punishment goes down, we look for other options. So that's how the American public is viewing these issues. There's no reason to believe that our legislative leaders are looking at it any different. So part of this is how we define crime, how we perceive it, and that tells us something about the solutions, the responses that we try to develop. So what happens after that is that we've had a whole set of what I would call race-neutral policies and practices, or at least race-neutral on the surface, that are designed to enhance public safety. There's nothing in the policies themselves that says, the goal of this policy is to incarcerate people of color in particular. But if we dig down and look at the impact and look at the policies and practices, it's not hard to see how these outcomes could come about. We can see a contrast, for example, in drug policy. 1986, the country was just beginning to experience a crack cocaine epidemic, very bad drug, doing a lot of harm to individuals and communities around the country. Congress responded in almost record time by adopting very stiff mandatory sentencing policies for anyone convicted of a federal crack cocaine time. Many of you know that they also passed mandatory sentencing laws for powder cocaine. The crack cocaine laws were far more harsh than powder cocaine. Certainly at the time, the image of the person using or selling crack was that of a young black man. Whether or not that was entirely correct, that was the image. And for powder cocaine, the image was much more a young white man or woman, too. So that's how we approach it, very stiff penalties. Now we come 30 years later, we're in the middle of the opioid epidemic, which is equally damaging to families and communities. And while the approach to opioids is mixed, there's been far more discussion, far more policy development focused on prevention and treatment, trying to understand how do people get caught up in this new drug epidemic, what do we know about treatment for them, what kind of resources should we apply to the problem, things like that. All the right questions to ask, but we're asking, I think, a different set of questions than were asked by policymakers back in the 1980s. We see it in other ways, other policies coming out of the war on drugs as well. Every state now has some type of drug-free school zone policy. What these policies are designed for basically is nobody wants a drug dealer coming onto the playground during their kids' lunch recess, right? We can all agree on that. Now, we already have laws that penalize that, but the drug-free school zone laws enhance the penalty for any drug crime committed in what's called a school zone. Now, the school zones are generally drawn, it's a radius around a school. Sometimes it's within 200 feet of a school. Sometimes in some states it can be a mile or more from the school. Now, why should this have a racial effect? Well, if you think about housing patterns and density issues, urban areas are very densely packed. So you've got lots of people living close together and lots of people living near schools just because things are not so spread out. So especially if the school zone is drawn 500 feet, 1,000 feet away from the school itself, in many jurisdictions, almost any drug crime could be considered a school zone drug crime in an urban area. In contrast, if we look at suburban areas, rural areas where things are more spread out, the same drug crime is far more likely to be subject to these enhanced penalties as it would be in an urban area. Well, people of color populate many urban areas in the country, therefore much more likely to be subject to these enhanced penalties. Several years ago, there was concern in New Jersey about these penalties, the legislature commissioned a study found that 96% of the people charged with a school zone offense were either African American or Latino. The legislature looked at this and made appropriate changes to the law to try to take this into account. Now, it's not just sentencing policies, it's decisions made by practitioners every day of the week, and practitioners at all levels of the system, many of whom are very decent people, committed to doing their work, not believing that they're adopting or carrying through racist assumptions in their work, but when you look at how policies are adopted day to day, we see, I think, very predictable racial effects. So let me give a couple of examples. In juvenile court in Portland, Oregon, several years ago, the local policymakers were concerned because they saw high rates of African American kids in juvenile detention, very broad disparities, black to white there. Now, one of the ways they made decisions about detention was they used a risk assessment instrument, basically looking at public safety concerns, whether a kid needed to be locked up or could be living in the community. So one of the questions on the risk assessment was, does this child have a, quote, good family structure? Good family structure. Now, some of us are fortunate to be born into a good family structure. Some of us are not so fortunate, but we're looking at the kid's outcome from something over which he or she has no control. Well, they looked at this and they said, why don't we change that question? So rather than a good family structure, they now say, is there a responsible adult who can help to supervise this young person? Now, the responsible adult might be a teacher, might be a minister, might be a basketball coach, but somebody who could take on the public safety and the supportive roles. Once they adopted that, the number of black kids who were detained went down significantly. So little changes making a very big difference. Another study, also in juvenile court, was looking at the probation officer's recommendations to the judge when a juvenile was being adjudicated. The study looked at the narrative portion of the pre-sentence report, so the portion where the probation officers interviewed the young person, who writes up to the judge, gives the judge a sense of who is this young person, why did he or she commit this offense, make recommendations for what should be done. So when they looked at the narrative section of the report, what they found was the white kids tended to be defined as having environmental problems. So they were, having fights within their family, they were acting out at school, they were hanging out with the wrong kinds of kids after school, those kinds of things. The black kids were more likely to be defined as having an antisocial personality. Now, what's the meaning of all this? What's the difference? Well, if we're talking about environmental problems, there are things that we could try to do about that. We could bring in a social worker to work with the family and help the kid become adjusted and help the family issues work through. At school, we could have tutors if necessary. We could have peer mediation programs, a variety of things that we could try to help the young person get through this time in their life. On the other hand, if a kid is defined as having an antisocial personality, we can't very well give them a new personality. It doesn't work like that. So a judge thinking about public safety is going to be much more likely to say, we've got to lock this kid up because public safety demands that we do it this way. So these are not necessarily bad people making these decisions. They're generally hardworking, well-intended, but unless we help think through the consequences of the perceptions that people have, it's only going to reinforce some of the patterns that have developed over many, many years. Now, if we look at mass incarceration overall, presumably the goal of having more than 2 million people behind bars is to promote public safety, right? The idea is either we'll incapacitate people, keep them behind bars so they can't do harm in the community, we'll deter others from committing crimes, maybe we'll rehabilitate them, but it's all premised on public safety. So what do we know about the impact of what's happened there? How has this played out? Well, it is true, prison has some impact on crime. We can all think of somebody who's committed some horrendous crimes or terrorism or something like that, for whom having a person isolated behind bars provides some protection to the community. But as an overall policy, as an overall development, the impact of mass incarceration on crime is generally much more modest than many people believe and many policymakers believe. And we're also at a point of diminishing returns for public safety for the numbers of people we have in prison. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Let me describe a couple of them. One is in regard to who we decide to incarcerate in prisons. Imagine now we have a small prison system. We've got 100 beds in a given jurisdiction. So who do we choose to put in those 100 beds? Well, I think most people would say, anyone convicted of murder, rape, robbery, we should prioritize using those prison beds for those people. They deserve it. We need to protect it from them and the like. So that's what we would do. Now suppose we have a jurisdiction with 10,000 beds. Who should we put in there? Well, we don't have 10,000 people convicted of murder, rape, robbery. So we lock up those people, but now we lock up a lot more burglars, we lock up a lot more drug offenders, we lock up a lot more car thieves and the like, and lesser severe crimes. So as the system continues to expand, there's only so many of the most serious offenses that we can deal with this way. So we almost inevitably start to lock up far too many people who are not nearly the same threat to public safety. So in terms of what impact we get, it's less and less as we move on. The impact of incarceration is diminished because of the degree to which people age out of crime. Criminologists have known for a long time that crime rates are very much correlated with age. As I described, the young group of young men and young women to some extent, 15 to 24, their involvement in crime goes high in the late teen years, early 20 years, but then comes down pretty sharply. So that in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s, their engagement in crime is far less than it was when they were younger. So think about how our system works. Somebody's convicted of an armed robbery at the age of 25. We send him off to prison for a long prison term because that's a very serious crime. By the time that person is 30, 35, 40 years old in prison, in many cases, he represents a much less serious threat to public safety than that 25-year-old who was locked up. And people in prison are no different than the rest of us. We all mature as we grow up. We all become adults. We start to look at the world differently. Those of you over the age of 25 here, we can look back at some of the things we did as teenagers, and we may not be proud of them now, and we may have escaped contact with the justice system or not, but that's not who we are today. So people grow up, they're less of a threat to people on the outside. So again, we keep people year after year getting less public safety out of it, and at great cost too. Particularly with the elderly prison population, it's growing quite dramatically. The cost of health care in prison goes up dramatically as well. You can see some states now that have whole geriatric wings for prisoners who are going around in wheelchairs, have severe medical conditions. Some of them committed very serious crimes when they were younger. Some committed crimes not so serious but got long prison terms. So how do we spend our public safety dollars? What is the way to do that? The other consideration to keep in mind, I think, is that we often get into debates about, well, how much does incarceration help to reduce crime? And some people say a lot, and some people say a little, and there's a lot of academic research on this. That's an important question. We need to look through that very carefully, but it's not the only question we need to ask. I think a more important question is, if we wanted to spend $1 million to have an impact on crime, how would we do that? Would we build $1 million worth of prison cells? Would we put $1 million into preschool education? Would we put $1 million into policing, into substance abuse treatment programs? That's how we should be making decisions. That's what policymakers should be doing. The goal is public safety. What's the mix of approaches that we should be taking to get the most effective use of money and the most compassionate use of it as well? So we know something about that impact of mass incarceration, but we also know that the impact on people going through the system, African Americans and others as well, is not just a question of doing your time in prison. We used to say you have to pay your debt to society, but we now know is that that debt to society never ends. It's a lifelong debt long after you've served your time. We start with the societal stigma for people who have a felony conviction on their record and are often shunned from various kinds of opportunities. There are significant barriers to employment for people who have a felony conviction, barriers to getting into public housing. Many states you lose your right to vote for some period of time, in some states for the rest of your life, even if you have a single felony conviction. Your ability to get welfare benefits, food stamps can be affected depending on the state in which you live. So you do your time in prison, then we tell you you're done with that, now you can move on, but moving on turns out to be very difficult because of all these added restrictions that we've placed on people who have these convictions. So how do we challenge mass incarceration? How do we challenge the racial disparities that have accompanied that, have propelled that to sort of world record levels in recent years? It's a very complicated question. There's lots of people working on these issues, lots of change going on in the system today, and much of it's very encouraging. Let me just think about three kind of broad approaches that I think we should keep in mind as we try to achieve a smaller system of justice and a more effective system of justice, I would suggest. So the first approach I would call, we need to level the playing field. What I mean by that is that we have what we know is often a two-tiered system of justice. It operates, one that operates for those families, communities with resources, and one for those that don't have. Let me just tell you a quick story about a friend of mine. My friend and his wife were parents to 3 teenage kids, 2 girls and a boy. A few years ago, their teenage son started acting like a teenage boy. So he was staying out late at night, his grades were suffering at school, he was smashing up the family car now and then, there may have been some drinking and drug use. So his parents were concerned. It wasn't terrible, but they were concerned about the direction things were going. And then one night they get a call from the police saying they just picked up their son at the local 7-Eleven for shoplifting from the store. Could they come down to the police station and pick him up? So they go down to the police station, and over the course of the next 2 weeks, they start having discussions first with the police and then with the prosecutor assigned to the case. What my friend said was, our son's been having trouble, we know it, he knows it. We found a social worker who we think can help him and help us work through these problems together as a family. And the prosecutor said, well, that sounds fine. This is his first offense. It's not a serious offense. It sounds like you have a good plan. I think we can drop the charges and you go and work on this as a family. So he goes off and works with the social worker, and yes, things start to improve, and now it looks like he can go on and have a good middle-class lifestyle as he chooses. Now, the same night that my friend's son was arrested, I would imagine there was another young man arrested for the same crime not very far away, only his parents may not have had the financial resources to bring in a private social worker. They may not have had the negotiating skills to deal with the police and the prosecutor. So the case would go through the justice system. Now, you're not going to go to prison on your first shoplifting conviction, but you'll get a misdemeanor conviction or a citation or something like that. You may need to do some community service. You may need to do some restitution, some kind of supervision. But 6 or 12 months from now, the same kid gets picked up for breaking into a car or a home or stealing something from a store. And all of a sudden, he starts looking like one of these habitual offenders that we hear about, and he starts to go down a very different path than my friend's son is going down. So we're talking about the same crime, but the family resources, the community resources, allow one kid to go down a certain path that doesn't involve the justice system. The other kid goes in the justice system, and once you go in the justice system, it becomes very difficult to get out of it. You go deeper and deeper in far too many cases. So we want to level the playing field so that money doesn't buy justice. So what does this mean? Well, we have a system of money bail, where money determines whether you can be out of jail while you're awaiting trial, consulting with your lawyer, working with your family, keeping your job. The kind of indigent defense people get. There are some public defender offices that would be the first people I would call if I was charged with a felony, because they provide excellent representation. But there's also indigent defense in many rural counties in particular, where you get people, attorneys coming to court, who don't even know who their client is on the day they have to enter a plea. So we should level the playing field, level the bar for representation. Access to treatment programs, alternatives to incarceration, also very dependent on access to private resources. The second approach, I would say, is we want to be proactive in how we think about racial disparities in particular. You know, back in 1986, when Congress adopted the harsh crack cocaine penalties, there was not a minute of time spent debating about who would be subject to these penalties and what could be, was this an appropriate way to go. The imagery in people's minds was young black men, and that in fact is exactly how it worked out. 80% of the people prosecuted under those laws have been African American. We should have been having that conversation back in 1986. So to try to avoid that happening again, the Sensing Project, we've worked with legislators in a number of states to advance a policy called racial impact statement legislation. Now, this is similar to environmental impact statements, where it's become a routine part of policy making. If you want to build a dam, you want to build a construction site of some sort, you have to look at the impact on the local environment, animal life, plant life, and the like, and because there are frequently unintended consequences. And we want to look at those consequences before we do it, not after. So racial impact statements basically say if you're proposing to adopt new sentencing policies, parole policies, we should do some projections of what the racial ethnic effect of those policies will be. If there's a disparate racial effect, then legislators should consider whether there's a way of achieving the public safety goal without exacerbating the racial effects. So far in 4 states, state legislative bodies have adopted these policies: Iowa, Connecticut, Oregon, and just last month, New Jersey also. It's encouraging a conversation about race and justice policy. We should have in the open, we should do it proactively if we want both fairness and justice to come out. And then let me close with the third approach, which I would say is thinking about the meaning of community as we think about the justice system. Some of you remember 20 years ago or so, in the mid-90s, there was a small group of high-profile commentators who coined a new term, and that was super predators, and they would define this as this coming generation of young kids who are going to be wilder, more out of control, more dangerous than any generation of children we had ever seen before. They were never quite said it, but it's quite clear they were talking about a group of 5-year-old black boys and warning us that in 10 years this would be the worst crime wave we'd ever see. They were invited to testify in Congress. They had op-ed articles in the Wall Street Journal, very high profile for this. Well, they weren't very good social scientists because not long after they came up with this term of super predators, crime rates started to go down. They went down for adults and juveniles alike. Among juveniles, they went down for white, black, Latino, and other groups, and they've continued to go down for about 20 years now. So they didn't really have a good sense of social dynamics, although they did a lot of harm in terms of policy. But think for a minute, suppose we had a situation where we had reason to believe that there was a group of 5-year-old boys who were going to be a real threat to public safety 10 years from now. What would we do about this? It seems to me we have two choices. The first choice would be to say, why don't we start building prisons as quickly as we can so we'll be ready to lock up all these kids when they turn 15 or 16. That would be the way to anticipate how to deal with this problem. And if it's someone else's kid, a lot of people would be happy to take that on as their proposed solution. The other opportunity, the other choice would be to say, this is bad news, but the good news is we have a 10-year window of opportunity, 10 years before these crime rates get out of control. So what can we do over the next decade to intervene and support these families and these communities to try to reduce the risk of this crime wave that some people believe is going to have? What interventions do we need in terms of schooling, in terms of healthcare, in terms of counseling, substance abuse, and the like, to try to keep this problem down? Well, the first solution represents other people's kids. The second solution, I think, is what we would do, any of us, if it were our kids that were being talked about. Any compassionate parent would say, let's try to get at the sources of the problem. Let's try to deal with it this way. So I think what we need to do in public policy is to say, we need to treat every child as if they were our child. If we can get to a point of doing that, then I think we get to a much better policy around public safety, not to mention a much less racist society and a much more compassionate society. I think that's our goal. I want to thank you again so much for inviting me here for this wonderful award, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you.